The year is 711. The air is thick with salt and anticipation as a fleet of ships cuts through the churning waters of the Strait of Gibraltar. On the lead vessel stands a Berber general, Tariq ibn Ziyad, his eyes fixed on the distant shores of Hispania. Behind him, 7,000 men whisper prayers, their voices carried away by the wind. Many had never seen battle outside North Africa, all knew they were outnumbered. As dawn breaks over the water, Tariq addresses his men, his voice carrying across the waves. "My brothers, before you lies the enemy, behind you lies the sea. By Allah, there is nowhere to flee except forward." The fate of two civilizations hangs in this moment, a fractured Visigothic kingdom that had ruled Hispania for centuries, and a rising Islamic Caliphate with ambitions that stretched from Central Asia to the Atlantic. Within months, this small invasion force would topple a kingdom that had stood for 300 years, changing the face of Europe forever. But how did a vastly outnumbered Muslim army defeat a powerful Christian kingdom? And how did they not just conquer Spain, but establish a civilization that would flourish for centuries, creating one of history's most remarkable cultural golden ages? This is not just a story of battles and conquest. This is a tale of betrayal, ambition, and cultural transformation. A moment when the course of European history pivoted on the decisions of a handful of men. So settle in and prepare to journey back to a world on the edge of transformation. Before we continue, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Dark History Class. Leave a comment about what you already know about Muslim Spain or what you hope to learn. Your support helps us bring more of these forgotten moments of history to life. The story of the Umayyad conquest of Spain represents one of history's most dramatic civilizational encounters. On one side stood the Visigothic kingdom of Hispania, a once powerful realm now crippled by internal divisions, where the crown changed hands through assassination more often than succession, and where noble families commanded private armies larger than the royal guard. On the other side was the Umayyad Caliphate, an Islamic empire that had expanded with breathtaking speed from its Arabian heartland to become one of history's most successful imperial projects, stretching from the borders of China to the shores of the Atlantic. Their collision would reshape the religious, cultural, and intellectual landscape of medieval Europe. But here lies the central irony of our story. The Visigothic kingdom didn't fall because the invaders were so strong. It fell because it was rotting from within. The crown was contested, the nobility was fractured, and persecuted populations across the peninsula had little reason to fight for their Visigothic overlords. And yet, the very methods that made the Islamic conquest so swift and complete, tolerance of religious diversity, preservation of local institutions, and accommodation with local elites, would eventually plant the seeds for the eventual Christian reconquest centuries later. To understand how it all unfolded, we must first step back to the year 710, a moment when a king's death would trigger a crisis that would echo across centuries. The stage was set for one of history's most consequential conquests, a moment when the actions of a few men would determine the fate of millions. But what happens next will stun you. The desperate gamble of a Berber general, the fatal mistakes of a usurper king, and the battlefield betrayal that changed everything, all coming up as we uncover how a civilization fell in the span of a single summer day and how another rose to take its place. To follow that path to its stunning conclusion, subscribe to Dark History Class and turn on notifications. The story of how Islamic civilization transformed Europe awaits. In the early 8th century, the Iberian Peninsula presented a portrait of a civilization in decline, masked by the veneer of royal ceremony and Christian orthodoxy. The Visigothic kingdom of Hispania, established in the aftermath of Rome's collapse, had ruled the peninsula for nearly 3 centuries, yet by 710 CE it stood as a hollow shell of its former strength. A kingdom where the crown changed hands through assassination more often than succession, where noble families wielded private armies larger than the royal guard, and where the very foundations of unity had crumbled into competing power centers. The Visigothic nobility, descendants of Germanic warriors who had once served Rome as foederati, had transformed over centuries from tribal chieftains into landed aristocrats. However, this transformation had not brought stability. Instead, it created a feudal patchwork where loyalty was purchased rather than earned, and where the throne itself had become merely the grandest prize in an endless game of political musical chairs. Beneath the political chaos lay deeper structural problems that would prove fatal when external pressure arrived. The Visigothic kingdom was not a unified Christian realm, despite the official conversion from Arianism to Catholic Christianity under King Roderic in 587 CE. Instead, it contained multiple populations with varying degrees of loyalty to the Gothic state and its religious establishment. The Jewish communities of Hispania represented perhaps the most significant internal tension. Subjected to increasingly harsh persecution under kings like Sigebert and Egica, Jewish populations had been forbidden to own Christian slaves, excluded from public office, and subjected to forced conversions that created a substantial population of conversos whose loyalty to the Christian state remained questionable. The Hispano-Roman population, though nominally integrated into Visigothic society, retained distinct cultural and linguistic identities. In many regions, particularly in the south and east, Gothic settlement had been sparse, leaving Roman administrative structures and local elites largely intact. These populations had adapted to Gothic rule but felt little emotional investment in its continuation. Perhaps most significantly, the peninsula contained substantial populations of slaves and semi-free agricultural workers whose loyalty to any particular ruler was minimal. The Visigothic economy remained fundamentally agricultural, with large estates worked by dependent laborers who had little stake in the political arrangements that governed their lives. Into this fractured realm stepped Roderic, a professional soldier whose military skill had earned him command of the royal armies. In 710 CE, following King Witiza's death, Roderic seized the throne through force rather than consensus, a usurpation that would have profound consequences. The threats to our kingdom grow by the day. Only through strength and unity can Hispania survive. I have fought on our borders and seen what approaches. Those who stand with me shall prosper. Those who oppose me will answer for their treason. Roderic embodied the tragic paradox of the Visigothic leadership, militarily competent but politically compromised. His commitment to personal honor, while admirable in individual terms, proved catastrophically unsuited to the political realities of his situation. When faced with external threats, his instinct was to meet them through direct military confrontation, treating conflicts as conventional wars between rival kingdoms rather than recognizing them as multidimensional political crises that required diplomatic as well as military solutions. Despite his political failures, contemporary sources acknowledge Roderic's exceptional military competence. His career prior to becoming king had been spent in frontier warfare against Basque populations and in suppressing noble rebellions, experiences that provided him with detailed knowledge of peninsular military conditions and tactics. His innovations in Visigothic military organization, particularly his attempts to create a more centralized command structure and standardized equipment, demonstrated awareness of the kingdom's military weaknesses. Across the Strait of Gibraltar, a very different kind of state was reaching the zenith of its power. The Umayyad Caliphate, established after the First Islamic Civil War, 656 to 661 CE, represented one of history's most successful examples of imperial expansion and administration. Under the Umayyad dynasty, the Islamic State had expanded from its Arabian heartland to encompass territories from Central Asia to the Atlantic Ocean, creating an empire that rivaled Rome at its peak. The Caliphate's success rested on several key pillars that stood in stark contrast to Visigothic weaknesses. First, the Islamic State possessed a unifying ideology that transcended tribal and ethnic boundaries. While internal disputes over succession and religious interpretation certainly existed, the concept of the Ummah, community of believers, provided a framework for incorporating diverse populations that the ethnic nationalism of the Visigoths could not match. Second, the Umayyad military machine represented a fusion of Arab tactical innovation, Byzantine administrative efficiency, and local military traditions from conquered territories. The Islamic armies were not merely Arab tribal forces, but sophisticated military organizations that combined the mobility of desert warfare with the discipline of professional soldiers and the local knowledge of recently converted populations. Third, the Caliphate's administrative system, heavily influenced by Byzantine and Sasanian models, provided effective governance for diverse populations. The dhimmi system, while establishing Muslims as a ruling class, offered protection and limited autonomy to people of the book, Christians and Jews, creating incentives for peaceful submission rather than desperate resistance. Within this dynamic imperial system, Tariq ibn Ziyad emerges as one of history's most enigmatic military commanders, a man whose single campaign changed the course of European history, yet whose personal background remains shrouded in contradictory accounts and later mythologizing. The few biographical details available suggest that Tariq rose from relatively humble origins among the Berber tribes of the Atlas Mountains. His early life would have been shaped by the brutal Islamic conquest of the Maghreb, during which Berber populations experienced the full spectrum of conquest's consequences, from wholesale slaughter to integration into the conquering armies. His conversion to Islam, like that of many Berbers, was likely pragmatic rather than mystical, representing a path to advancement within the new order rather than a spiritual transformation. However, sources suggest that Tariq developed genuine appreciation for Islamic military organization and administrative efficiency, seeing in them solutions to the tribal conflicts that had plagued Berber society. A warrior gains glory by charging into battle. A commander achieves victory by knowing his enemy before the battle begins. The Goths are divided, their king unloved, their people restless. Their weakness is our opportunity. For Tariq and his Berber troops, success in Hispania represented more than conquest. It was the validation of a people seeking to prove their worth within the Islamic world. As a newly converted population, the Berbers faced constant suspicion from Arab elites who questioned both their commitment to Islam and their reliability as military allies. Victory would secure their place in the new order. What distinguished Tariq from other commanders of his era was his sophisticated understanding of information warfare. Unlike purely military leaders who relied on superior force, Tariq operated an extensive intelligence network that provided detailed information about Visigothic political divisions, economic weaknesses, and military dispositions. Overseeing the western expansion of the Islamic Empire was Musa ibn Nusayr, who stands as one of the Umayyad Caliphate's most successful proconsuls, a commander whose vision extended far beyond tactical victory to encompass the strategic transformation of conquered territories into productive provinces. Conquest without governance is merely raiding. We do not come as thieves in the night, but as builders of a new order. The wealth of Hispania will flow to Damascus, and its people will know the justice of Islamic rule. Musa's correspondence with the Caliph, preserved in fragmentary form by later historians, reveals a man obsessed with his place in Islamic history. As an Arab of the conquest generation, he had witnessed the transformation of a tribal confederation into a world empire and sought to secure his own role in that transformation through achievements that would be remembered by posterity. His approach to conquest differed fundamentally from earlier Islamic commanders who focused primarily on immediate military objectives. Musa's campaigns in North Africa and his planning for the Iberian invasion demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of imperial administration that looked beyond initial conquest to the long-term integration of new territories. The Islamic conquest of North Africa, completed by 709 CE under the leadership of Musa ibn Nusayr, created the immediate preconditions for expansion into Hispania. The Maghreb campaigns had been brutal affairs, with fierce resistance from Berber populations that were ultimately overcome through a combination of military force and strategic accommodation. The key insight of Islamic commanders was that conquered Berber populations could be transformed from enemies into allies through conversion and integration into the Islamic military structure. The Berber conversions to Islam were often pragmatic rather than deeply spiritual, but they created a substantial population of new Muslims eager to prove their devotion and gain their share of conquest's rewards. These Berber converts would form the backbone of the invasion forces that crossed into Hispania, fighting with the particular intensity of the recently converted, seeking to establish their place in the Islamic order. The narrow waters separating Africa from Europe, known to the Romans as the Pillars of Hercules and to the Arabs as Jabal Tariq, Mountain of Tariq, represented both a barrier and an opportunity. For the Visigoths, the strait provided natural protection that had kept their kingdoms safe from direct African threats for centuries. For the Islamic forces, however, the strait represented merely a tactical problem to be solved rather than an insurmountable obstacle. The death of King Witiza around 710 CE crystallized these tensions into open conflict. His reign, lasting from 702 to his death, had been marked by attempts at reconciliation with enemies of the state and efforts to strengthen royal authority, policies that earned him both gratitude from some quarters and bitter resentment from others. The Chronicle of 754, our primary contemporary source, suggests that Witiza had begun grooming his son Aquila as successor, a move that directly challenged the elective principle that theoretically governed Visigothic succession. The immediate aftermath of Witiza's death revealed the depth of divisions within Visigothic society. Rather than rallying around the designated heir, noble factions began maneuvering for advantage, with some supporting Aquila's claim, while others threw their support behind alternative candidates. The stage was set for disaster. For Roderic, the kingdom's most accomplished military commander, the succession crisis presented both danger and opportunity. Intelligence reports about Islamic preparations convinced him that only strong, centralized leadership could organize effective resistance against the threat from across the strait. Hispania stands at the precipice. While nobles squabble over titles, our enemies prepare for war. The kingdom cannot afford a child king or months of civil conflict. The time for decisive action is now. Roderic's military coup succeeded in the short term. With the support of the kingdom's most experienced commanders, he seized the throne through force rather than election. But in solving one problem, he created another far more dangerous, a crisis of legitimacy that would undermine his rule from the very beginning. His usurpation violated both legal precedent and political expectations, creating a legitimacy crisis that would plague his entire reign. The personal letters preserved in the Chronicle of 754 reveal a man acutely aware of his precarious position, constantly seeking confirmation of loyalty from subordinates who had every reason to betray him. His correspondence shows increasing paranoia and isolation as reports of Islamic preparations reached his court, yet also reveals a sharp intelligence that correctly identified the kingdom's fundamental vulnerabilities. News of Witiza's death and the subsequent power struggle reached Musa ibn Nusayr and Tariq ibn Ziyad almost immediately. Their network of spies and informants provided detailed reports of every development in the Visigothic succession crisis. So the soldier has made himself king, but do his people accept him as such? No, Commander. Many nobles refuse to recognize his claim. Witiza's family has fled to the north, but they maintain significant support. A kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. The moment we have waited for has arrived. For Islamic commanders, Roderic's usurpation created exactly the kind of political chaos they had been waiting for, a legitimacy crisis that would prevent unified resistance. What had seemed a distant possibility now became an immediate opportunity. Musa ibn Nusayr sent a formal request to Damascus, seeking the Caliph's permission for a full-scale invasion of Hispania. His letter outlined not just military objectives, but plans for governance and administration, how Islamic rule would transform conquered territories into productive provinces. Meanwhile, Roderic faced mounting problems. His correspondence reveals a man acutely aware of his precarious position, constantly seeking confirmation of loyalty from subordinates who had every reason to betray him. More nobles declaring for Attila in the north, Jewish communities in communication with agents from Africa, the Bishop of Seville questioning the legitimacy of my coronation. Sire, we also have reports of Islamic ships conducting reconnaissance along our southern coast. Let them come. I have fought border skirmishes my entire life. I know their tactics, their weaknesses. What I need is loyalty from those who should be my subjects. Rather than attempting reconciliation with Witiza's supporters, Roderic pursued a policy of systematic persecution that drove potential allies into the arms of the invaders. His honor code demanded punishment of those who opposed his legitimacy, even when pragmatic politics suggested forgiveness and incorporation. The period between Witiza's death and the actual invasion witnessed intensive military preparations on both sides of the strait, but with dramatically different levels of effectiveness and coordination. The contrast between Islamic systematic preparation and Visigothic improvised response illustrates how institutional strength translates into military capability. Islamic military preparations followed well-established patterns developed during previous conquests. Supply networks were established, transport arrangements were made, and invasion forces were assembled from diverse populations with complementary military specialties. Arab cavalry provided mobile striking power, Berber infantry offered local knowledge and fierce motivation, and experienced siege specialists from Syria brought technical expertise for reducing fortified positions. Visigothic military preparations, by contrast, were hampered by the political divisions that Roderic's usurpation had created. While the new king demonstrated clear awareness of the external threat and attempted to mobilize the kingdom's military resources, his political illegitimacy meant that many potential supporters remained uncommitted to his cause. By April 711, the accumulation of Islamic advantages had created what appeared to be an inevitable outcome. Superior intelligence, political preparation, military readiness, and strategic timing had combined to create conditions where invasion success seemed predetermined. For Tariq ibn Ziyad, the decision to lead the invasion represented a calculated risk that could either establish his reputation or destroy it entirely. Arab commanders had questioned whether a non-Arab should lead such a significant operation, while some Berber leaders worried that failure would bring collective punishment upon their communities. All my life I have been judged not by my abilities but by my birth. The Arabs see only a Berber, useful but never equal. This crossing will prove what we are capable of. Success will earn my people respect. Failure will confirm every prejudice against us. The risk is great, but the opportunity greater. Tariq's force of approximately 7,000 men was modest by the standards of great conquests. Yet what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in motivation, preparation, and the element of surprise. The Berber troops, fighting with the particular intensity of the recently converted, were eager to prove their devotion and gain their share of conquest's rewards. The sea is behind you, the enemy before you. By Allah, there is no escape except in victory. You have left no refuge behind you. You have only truth and patience. The crossing of the Strait of Gibraltar in April 707 represented one of history's most audacious military operations. Transporting thousands of men with their equipment, supplies and horses across 14 kilometers of open water required sophisticated planning and flawless execution. Any significant failure during the crossing would have left the invasion force vulnerable to destruction by Visigothic naval forces or coastal defenses. The logistical challenges of the crossing were immense. The Islamic forces needed to coordinate multiple ship movements while maintaining operational security and preparing for immediate combat upon landing. The timing of the crossing was crucial to its success. April weather conditions provided the optimal combination of favorable winds and minimal storm risk, while the ongoing Visigothic succession crisis meant that coordinated resistance was unlikely. As the Islamic force crossed from Africa to Europe, two worlds collided, one ascending, one declining. The Visigothic kingdom, weakened by internal division and political fragility, faced the expansion of an empire at the height of its power and confidence. The consequences would echo through centuries, transforming not just Hispania, but the future of Europe itself. The die was cast. The road to ruin for Visigothic Hispania had reached its point of no return, and the foundations of a new world were being laid with every footstep on European soil. The landing was merely the beginning. After Tariq ibn Ziyad's forces secured their beachhead on European soil in April 711, the real work of conquest began, a methodical, exhausting campaign that would test the limits of Islamic logistics, diplomacy, and military endurance. The weeks and months that followed the crossing would determine whether this audacious gamble would end in triumph or disaster. Day by day, mile by mile, fortress by fortress, the Islamic advance continued with a relentless precision that belied the immense challenges. With each settlement encountered, Tariq's forces faced the same critical choice: negotiate or fight, accommodate or destroy. The systematic approach to these decisions revealed the sophisticated conquest strategy that distinguished the Islamic expansion from mere raiding expeditions. For Islamic soldiers, the campaign became a grinding test of endurance. Marching through unfamiliar terrain, far from established supply lines, each man carried not just weapons and provisions, but the weight of their collective ambition. Berber infantry trudged through mountains and valleys, still bearing the scars of recent conversion to Islam. Arab cavalry patrolled constantly, their horses growing leaner as pasturage became scarce. Every man understood that retreat was impossible. Success was the only path to survival. Intelligence gathering never ceased. While military operations progressed, Tariq's network of spies and informants expanded throughout southern Hispania, cultivating local allies and gathering crucial information about Visigothic movements. Jewish communities, persecuted under Gothic rule, proved particularly valuable sources of intelligence. Towns with significant Jewish populations often opened their gates without resistance, having received assurances of better treatment under Islamic governance. The archaeological evidence from sites along Tariq's route reveals a campaign of careful preparation rather than impulsive advance. Supply caches established in advance, pre-positioned equipment, and evidence of systematic foraging all indicate planning that went far beyond improvised opportunism. While Visigothic forces scrambled to respond, Islamic commanders executed a strategy years in the making. Yet challenges mounted with each passing week. Summer heat intensified, taxing men and animals already pushed to their limits. Water supplies grew precarious as the campaign moved inland. Medical resources were stretched thin, caring for the wounded and sick. Local resistance, while disorganized, caused constant attrition through ambushes and small-scale engagements. These physical challenges were matched by political complexities. Tariq's dual mandate to secure military victory while establishing the foundations for stable governance created competing priorities that required careful balancing. The treatment of conquered populations followed sophisticated protocols developed during previous Islamic expansions. Christian communities that surrendered voluntarily received guarantees of religious autonomy under the dhimmi system, while those that resisted faced harsher terms. This carrot and stick approach encouraged pragmatic accommodation rather than desperate resistance. For individual Islamic soldiers, the campaign's rewards remained tantalizing but distant. The promise of land grants, slaves, and treasure that had motivated many to join the expedition could only be realized after complete victory. As weeks stretched into months, maintaining discipline and motivation became increasingly challenging. Religious commitment provided one solution. Daily prayers and recitation of Quranic verses reinforced the sacred nature of their reshaped mission. Meanwhile, Tariq faced a parallel challenge that few commanders could have managed effectively. His relationship with his superior, Musa ibn Nusayr, grew increasingly strained as the campaign progressed. Tariq's decision to continue the conquest beyond his original mandate, capturing significant territories before Musa's arrival, demonstrated exceptional military judgment but violated the chain of command that held the Islamic State together. Every message sent across the strait carried political implications. Tariq's reports emphasized the opportunities for rapid expansion, while Musa's responses urged caution and adherence to the original plan. This tension between immediate military advantage and long-term political considerations would eventually have profound consequences for both men, regardless of the campaign's outcome. As Tariq's forces secured control of southern Hispania, a crucial decision loomed: whether to consolidate gains or push northward toward Toledo, the Visigothic capital. Islamic sources suggest heated debates among Tariq's commanders, with some advocating consolidation, while others urged aggressive advance. The decision to push northward represented another calculated gamble, extending supply lines and reducing force concentration for the opportunity to decapitate Visigothic leadership before effective resistance could be organized. For Gothic populations throughout the invasion zone, the Islamic advance created impossible choices between loyalty to a crumbling regime and pragmatic accommodation to new realities. Local nobles faced particularly difficult decisions. Resistance might preserve honor but guarantee destruction, while collaboration might secure position under new rulers but mark them as traitors to their own people. The fragmentary evidence suggests that many chose a middle path, neither actively resisting nor enthusiastically collaborating, instead adopting a wait-and-see approach that preserved options regardless of the conflict's outcome. The figure of Oppa, identified in later sources as a Visigothic noble who allegedly facilitated the Islamic conquest, represents the moral complexity of these choices. His decision to negotiate with Islamic commanders rather than resist reveals a calculated assessment that collaboration offered better prospects for his people than hopeless resistance. For communities exhausted by internal conflict, such pragmatism may have appeared more attractive than Roderic's inflexible honor. While Tariq's forces advanced methodically through southern Hispania, King Roderic faced his own grinding challenge, assembling an army capable of confronting the invasion while maintaining political control over a fractious kingdom. The limited sources available suggest frantic activity throughout May and June as Roderic attempted to mobilize forces from across his realm. Messengers rode day and night, carrying royal commands to noble houses, many of which responded with deliberate delay or outright refusal. The king found himself commanding not a unified national army, but a patchwork of contingents with varying levels of commitment to his cause. Logistics constrained both sides. For Tariq, the challenge was maintaining supply lines that stretched increasingly far from his landing site. For Roderic, the difficulty lay in assembling and feeding a large army drawn from diverse regions with different agricultural cycles and transportation networks. Contemporary sources mention food shortages, equipment problems, and constant disputes over resources that plagued the Gothic mobilization effort. Time itself became a critical factor. Every day that passed allowed Tariq's forces to strengthen their position in southern Hispania, establishing administrative control and cultivating local allies. Yet every day also brought Roderic closer to assembling a force large enough to challenge the invasion. By late June, both commanders understood that decisive confrontation was inevitable and imminent. The weeks of advance and preparation culminated in early July as intelligence reports confirmed that Roderic was marching south with the largest Visigothic army seen in a generation, perhaps 25,000 men drawn from across the kingdom. Tariq, commanding approximately 12,000 troops after reinforcements arrived from North Africa, faced a critical decision: where and how to confront this numerically superior force. The choice of battlefield would prove decisive. Tariq selected a position near the Guadalquivir River that maximized his advantages: open ground that allowed Arab cavalry mobility, proximity to water sources essential for his troops, and terrain that could limit Gothic heavy cavalry effectiveness. Most crucially, the location forced Roderic's army to deploy in a way that exacerbated existing political tensions within his forces, with potentially disloyal contingents positioned where their actions or inactions would have maximum impact. As July's heat intensified, two armies converged toward a confrontation that would determine not merely the outcome of a campaign, but the future of a civilization. The grinding advance had tested both sides to their limits. Now would come the moment of truth, the pivot upon which history would turn. The Battle of Guadalete, fought in July 711, represents the single most important military engagement in Iberian history, a confrontation that determined not merely the fate of individual armies, but the cultural and religious trajectory of an entire civilization. What transpired over those fateful hours would reshape the map of Europe and alter the course of history for centuries to come. Dawn on the battle's first day revealed two armies separated by perhaps 3 kilometers of rolling terrain near tributaries of the Guadalquivir River. On the Visigothic side, Roderic's forces presented an impressive sight, nearly 25,000 men arranged in traditional formation, with heavy cavalry in the center flanked by infantry levies drawn from across the peninsula. The morning light glinted off iron spear points and bronze shield bosses, creating a visual display designed to intimidate. Yet a careful observer would have noted the gaps between different contingents, the hesitant response to trumpet calls, and the way certain units positioned themselves for easy withdrawal rather than maximum combat effectiveness. The Islamic forces, numbering perhaps 12,000 after reinforcements, presented a more compact but equally impressive array. Arab cavalry occupied the center and right wing, their movements coordinated with the precision of units that had fought together through multiple campaigns. Berber infantry held the left flank, their formation looser than Arab standards, but displaying the relaxed confidence of warriors fighting for a cause they believed heaven had blessed. The battle began not with dramatic charges, but with cautious maneuvering as both commanders sought to exploit terrain advantages while avoiding enemy strengths. Roderic's deployment reflected classical Visigothic tactics refined through decades of internal warfare. Heavy cavalry held in reserve while infantry established defensive positions that enemy forces would be compelled to attack uphill. Tariq's approach demonstrated the tactical innovations that had made Islamic armies successful across 3 continents. Rather than accepting battle on Visigothic terms, his forces began a complex series of movements designed to force Roderic into premature commitment of his reserves while maintaining Islamic options for exploitation and withdrawal. The morning's first combat occurred when Islamic light cavalry probed Visigothic positions along the left flank. The encounter itself was minor, perhaps 50 men engaged in a skirmish that lasted less than 10 minutes, but its psychological impact was significant. The ease with which Islamic forces approached Visigothic positions, exchanged missile fire, and withdrew without loss demonstrated a level of tactical sophistication that Gothic commanders found unsettling. Roderic's response revealed both his military competence and his political constraints. His decision to reinforce the threatened flank with additional cavalry showed sound tactical judgment, but his choice of commanders, nobles whose loyalty remained questionable, reflected the political necessities that compromise military efficiency during civil conflicts. Hour by hour, the tactical chess match continued. Tariq launched coordinated attacks against Visigothic positions on both flanks simultaneously. This was no accidental development, but the culmination of careful planning that exploited intelligence about Gothic command arrangements and political divisions. The attack on the right flank succeeded beyond Islamic expectations, when Gothic units commanded by supporters of Witiza's family offered minimal resistance before beginning what appeared to be organized withdrawal. Whether this represented treasonous collaboration or simply recognition that their position had become untenable remains disputed by historians, but the practical effect was to create a gap in Visigothic lines that Islamic cavalry immediately exploited. The crucial moment came when Roderic personally led his reserve cavalry in an attempt to seal the gap created by the withdrawal of unreliable units. This decision, militarily sound but politically catastrophic, placed the king at the center of the most intense fighting, just as the battle's outcome hung in balance. Roderic's final charge represented everything admirable and everything fatal about Visigothic kingship. His personal courage was unquestionable. Contemporary accounts describe him fighting in the front rank of his household cavalry, his presence instantly recognizable from the royal armor and insignia that made him a target for every Islamic warrior seeking glory and advancement. The tactical situation he faced was nearly impossible. The gap in his lines was widening as more units began unauthorized withdrawals, while Islamic forces were demonstrating the kind of coordinated tactical flexibility that could exploit any Gothic mistake. His options were limited to death in battle, flight that would confirm his cowardice, or surrender that would legitimize Islamic conquest. His choice to fight reflected not merely personal honor, but institutional necessity. Visigothic kingship, however weakened by civil conflict, retained enough symbolic power to influence the battle's outcome. His death or flight would signal final defeat in ways that no amount of subsequent resistance could reverse, while his continued presence provided the only realistic hope for rallying broken forces. Islamic sources report that Roderic fell to multiple wounds rather than a single killing blow, his death representing the cumulative effect of sustained combat rather than a moment of individual heroism by a particular enemy warrior. His body disappeared in the chaos of battlefield looting, creating uncertainty about his fate that would fuel centuries of legend and speculation. The death of Roderic around mid-afternoon marked not merely the end of a battle, but the transformation of Iberian political identity. The moment when his royal standard disappeared from the battlefield, whether through the king's death or the flight of his standard-bearer, was recognized by participants on both sides as the end of Visigothic independence and the beginning of Islamic rule. The psychological impact of this transformation was immediate and overwhelming. Gothic forces that had maintained effective resistance suddenly found themselves without legitimate authority to guide their actions. Individual commanders faced impossible choices between continued resistance without hope of success, flight that abandoned their responsibilities, or negotiation with enemies they had been trained to despise. For Islamic participants, the battle's final phases represented divine confirmation of their cause and personal validation of their sacrifices during the difficult years of North African warfare. The ease with which Visigothic resistance crumbled once royal authority disappeared seemed to confirm that Allah had predetermined their victory. The evening of July 19th brought an eerie quiet to the battlefield as Islamic forces consolidated their victory while Gothic survivors scattered across the countryside seeking safety. The contrast with the morning's organized military preparations was striking. What had begun as a conventional battle between rival kingdoms had ended as the foundation ceremony for a new political order. The immediate aftermath of Guadalete revealed the profound difference between military victory and political consolidation. While Islamic forces had achieved complete battlefield success, the more complex task of transforming conquest into stable governance required different skills and presented different challenges. Tariq's first priority was securing his lines of communication with North Africa while preventing any organized Gothic counterattack. The battlefield victory, however complete, had left Islamic forces isolated deep in potentially hostile territory with limited supplies and uncertain knowledge of enemy reserves. The systematic approach to these challenges demonstrated the professional competence that distinguished successful conquerors from merely successful raiders. The treatment of prisoners and battlefield casualties revealed important aspects of Islamic conquest strategy. Rather than pursuing the wholesale slaughter that characterized many medieval military victories, Islamic forces implemented policies designed to encourage submission while discouraging resistance. Gothic nobles who surrendered received treatment consistent with their social status, while common soldiers were offered opportunities for advancement through conversion and military service. The speed with which news of Roderic's death and Gothic defeat spread throughout the peninsula demonstrates the sophistication of communication networks that connected Iberian communities despite political fragmentation. Within hours of the battle's conclusion, messengers were carrying reports to major cities and religious centers, while merchant networks began adjusting their plans to accommodate new political realities. The immediate fate of surviving Gothic forces illustrated the complex dynamics of conquest and accommodation that would shape Iberian society for centuries. Unlike the binary outcomes typical of tribal warfare, victory or annihilation, the Islamic conquest operated according to more sophisticated principles that sought to incorporate rather than eliminate defeated populations. High-ranking Gothic nobles faced the most difficult decisions. Those who had actively supported Roderic's usurpation could expect little mercy from Islamic forces, while supporters of Witiza's family might find opportunities for accommodation with the new rulers. The political calculations that had divided Gothic society during the succession crisis continued to influence individual fates after military defeat. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with Gothic nobility reveals patterns of hasty abandonment that suggest many noble families chose flight over accommodation. valuable objects buried in obvious hiding places, unfinished construction projects, and evidence of rapid departure all indicate that significant portions of the Gothic elite preferred exile to submission. However, other evidence suggests that many Gothic nobles chose a different path. Islamic sources mention numerous Gothic administrators who continued their functions under new management, while the speed with which Islamic forces established effective governance suggests substantial cooperation from experienced local officials. The death of King Roderic during the Battle of Guadalete marked the effective end of Visigothic Hispania as an independent political entity. His body was never recovered, leading to centuries of speculation about his fate, but the political consequences of his disappearance were immediate and irreversible. The impossible gamble had paid off. Tariq ibn Ziyad had crossed an ocean with a small force, challenged a kingdom with centuries of history, and emerged triumphant against overwhelming odds. The pivot point of European history had arrived, the moment when the Islamic world firmly established its presence on European soil, forever changing the religious and cultural landscape of the continent. As night fell over the battlefield of Guadalete, few participants could have imagined how completely their actions would transform the future. What had begun as a military campaign had become the foundation for Al-Andalus, an Islamic realm in Europe that would flourish for nearly 8 centuries, creating a cultural synthesis that would influence philosophy, science, art, and architecture throughout the medieval world and beyond. The impossible gamble had become world-changing reality. The evening of July 711 descended upon a transformed landscape. Where that morning had seen the ordered ranks of Visigothic nobility gleaming in the sun, now lay scattered bodies, abandoned standards, and the detritus of a vanished kingdom. The battlefield fell quiet, except for the methodical movements of Islamic soldiers securing their victory and the occasional moans of the wounded. The metallic scent of blood mingled with dust and smoke hung heavy in the summer air. As night fell, fires from the Islamic camp illuminated a new reality. The Visigothic kingdom, a political entity that had stood for 3 centuries, had effectively ceased to exist in the span of a single day. King Roderic's body was never recovered, swallowed by the chaos of battle and the currents of history. His disappearance became both literal and metaphorical, the embodiment of an entire civilization's collapse. News spread across the peninsula with astonishing speed. In villages, towns, and cities, the message arrived with the same devastating clarity. The king is dead. His army is destroyed. The Moors are coming. For common people across Hispania, these words triggered immediate calculations of survival. Should they flee north? Submit to new rulers? Resist locally? Each family, each community faced impossible choices with limited information and little time. The human cost extended far beyond battlefield casualties. Thousands of Gothic nobles fled northward, abandoning estates, possessions, and communities they had governed for generations. Churches frantically concealed relics and manuscripts. Jewish communities, long persecuted under Visigothic rule, cautiously welcomed news that promised liberation from oppression. The social fabric unraveled and rewove itself in real time as the Islamic advance continued methodically northward. For Tariq's victorious forces, the immediate aftermath brought not just triumph, but immense responsibility. The conquest's success now demanded governance. Within days, Islamic administrators established protocols for managing surrendered towns, collecting taxes, and maintaining order. Their sophisticated approach, offering generous terms for voluntary submission while demonstrating overwhelming force against resistance, accelerated the political transformation. Cities surrendered without fighting, calculating that accommodation offered better prospects than sacrifice. Gothic survivors described the psychological impact as more devastating than the physical destruction. A nobleman who escaped to the north wrote that, "The world we knew vanished not slowly like mist, but suddenly like a candle extinguished." The certainties of Christian rule, however flawed in practice, had provided the fundamental framework of social order for generations. Their collapse left communities adrift, searching for new foundations of legitimacy and meaning. The events of 711 permanently altered the course of European history, creating consequences that echo into our present world. What began as a military campaign transformed into nearly 8 centuries of Islamic presence on European soil, producing a cultural synthesis that would fundamentally reshape Western civilization. The most immediate transformation appeared in governance. The sophisticated administrative systems of the Umayyad Caliphate replaced the fractious feudalism of Visigothic rule. Cities that had declined under Gothic management, Córdoba, Seville, Toledo, re-emerged as centers of commerce, learning, and arts. Islamic emphasis on urban infrastructure brought aqueducts, street lighting, public baths, and libraries to cities that had lost such amenities since Roman times. The intellectual legacy proved even more profound. Islamic Hispania, Al-Andalus, became the crucial transmission point for classical knowledge into medieval Europe. Greek philosophical and scientific texts, preserved and expanded by Muslim scholars, eventually returned to Christian Europe through translation centers like Toledo. Without this transmission, works by Aristotle, Euclid, Galen, and others might have been lost forever. The modern scientific method, medical knowledge, and philosophical traditions owe an incalculable debt to this cultural bridge. The economic revolution triggered by Islamic rule transformed European development. Agricultural innovations introduced during this period, irrigation systems, crop rotation, new plant species, dramatically increased productivity. Words in modern Spanish reveal this heritage. Alcachofa, artichoke, azuca, sugar, algodon, cotton, and hundreds more derived directly from Arabic, each representing knowledge transfers that shaped European economies. The central irony of the conquest is that the very completeness of Islamic victory contained the seeds of its eventual reversal. The same fragmentation that had enabled Islamic success against the Visigoths eventually manifested within Islamic Hispania itself. Christian kingdoms in the north, initially tiny and vulnerable, gradually expanded southward in the centuries-long process known as the Reconquista. By 1492, Granada fell as the last Islamic territory in Iberia, ending nearly 8 centuries of Muslim rule. Yet even after political control shifted, the cultural influences remained. Modern Spain and Portugal emerged not as purely Christian civilizations, but as complex cultural hybrids. Architecture, language, music, cuisine, and social customs all bear the indelible marks of this encounter between civilizations, neither fully European nor fully Islamic, but something uniquely Iberian. The conquest of 711 demonstrates history's most profound lesson. Power is temporary, but cultural exchange is permanent. The forces that appeared victorious ultimately faded, while the ideas, technologies, and arts they brought transformed the world in ways they could never have imagined. The story of the Umayyad conquest of Spain is more than a tale of victory or defeat. It's a lesson in ambition, unity, and the fragility of power. And history is filled with such forgotten moments that forged our world. For more of these dark, decisive chapters, subscribe to Dark History Class and turn on notifications. The past is waiting to be remembered.